The world in the opening days of 2026 has slipped into a state so bizarre it borders on the surreal. A global political drama is unfolding in plain sight, one so extreme that even the boldest Hollywood screenwriters would likely dismiss it as implausible. Yet this is no fiction. This is the reality of our time. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, once hailed as the cathedral of globalization, consensus, and elite diplomacy, American and European financial officials openly clashed to the point of walking out of meetings. The polite smiles and ritual invocations of shared values vanished. In their place emerged irritation, bitterness, and distrust. Davos, long a symbol of post-Cold War Western order, exposed the fractures running through its very foundation. Meanwhile, on social media, U.S. President Donald Trump, true to form, casually posted a map of North America in which Canada, Greenland, and even Venezuela were draped in the American flag. No declaration of war, no formal ultimatum, just a post. And yet that very nonchalance sent a chill through global capitals. This was not diplomacy. It was raw, instinctive power politics broadcast with a click. At the same time, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, head of the most powerful military alliance in human history, appeared in an almost tragic role, a strained conciliator, carefully stroking Donald Trump's ego in a desperate attempt to keep NATO from unraveling in practice, if not in name. The flattery, unprecedented in tone and visibility, revealed just how strategically dependent and vulnerable Europe has become. Amid this cacophony of chaos, outrage, and strategic misdirection, astute observers noticed something far more unsettling: Moscow's silence. No furious condemnations, no moral lectures, no theatrical outrage. Russian President Vladimir Putin entered the Greenland debate and the so-called Peace Council discussion with the calm of an old chess master, sitting atop a mountain while two tigers tear into each other below. And then, at precisely the right moment, he moved a single piece. With remarks that sounded almost casual about history, about money, Putin executed a stunning reversal, transforming Russia's apparent vulnerabilities into a finely honed weapon aimed directly at the West's internal contradictions. While the United States and Europe were busy tearing at one another over short-term calculations, the man in the Kremlin appeared to be quietly holding the key to a new strategic configuration. To understand the sophistication of this maneuver, one must begin at the eye of the storm: Greenland. Donald Trump's interest in acquiring the island is not new. During his first term, he openly floated the idea of purchasing Greenland. At the time, it was dismissed as provocation or eccentricity. This time, however, the approach was different. The pressure was overt, the tone coercive. Not only Denmark, but NATO itself was being pushed into line. Denmark was furious. Europe was stunned. The 19th century logic of buying and selling territory, long fought buried, had returned with startling bluntness. Copenhagen scrambled to find diplomatic language firm enough to refuse, yet soft enough not to antagonize the White House. And it was precisely at that moment that Vladimir Putin spoke. But he did not side with Europe in condemning American arrogance, nor did he join Washington in pressuring Denmark. Instead, he assumed a role no one anticipated: historical consultant and global real estate appraiser. Putin reminded the world that Russia had once sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. Adjusted for inflation, that figure would amount to roughly $160 million today. Greenland is slightly larger than Alaska, so what would be a fair price? $250 million? Or perhaps, if one wished to be generous, around $1 billion. On the surface, it sounded like a dry joke. In reality, it was a profoundly calculated move. First, Putin normalized Trump's madness in a way that benefited Russia. By putting a price tag, however absurd, on Greenland, he implicitly accepted the premise that territorial transactions between great powers are legitimate. This directly undermined Europe's moral argument that land and people are not commodities. The United States and Russia were placed within the same frame, superpowers entitled to redraw the map, while smaller states like Denmark were reduced to reluctant sellers. Second, Putin delivered a historical slap to Copenhagen. As Denmark appealed to morality and human rights, Putin gently reminded them that it was Denmark itself that sold the Virgin Islands to the United States over a century ago. So let us not speak of ethics, he implied. The remark exposed Europe's double standards and resurrected its colonial past, something it prefers to forget when lecturing others. He went further still, invoking Denmark's treatment of Greenland's indigenous population, opening up a sensitive internal wound. One stroke, multiple effects. Moral authority weakened, domestic divisions inflamed, and Denmark's negotiating position further destabilized. The $1 billion figure was steeped in irony. For the U.S. defense budget, it's pocket change, but for an island of immense strategic and resource value, it reduced geopolitics to a flea market transaction. Trump's bargaining instincts were triggered. Europe was humiliated, a flawless judo move. If Greenland was psychological warfare, then Putin's proposal regarding the Peace Council and Gaza reconstruction was a masterpiece of financial diplomacy. Trump proposed a new international mechanism to manage Gaza and invited Russia to participate. Under normal circumstances, a country under thousands of sanctions would either refuse or demand concessions. Putin did neither. He announced Russia's willingness to join preliminarily and, crucially, to contribute $1 billion to the fund. Where would the money come from? From Russia's frozen assets in Western banks. This was strategic brilliance at its peak. The roughly $300 billion in frozen Russian assets are effectively dead money, numbers locked on Western balance sheets. But by offering to donate $1 billion of it for humanitarian reconstruction, Putin redefined its purpose. Frozen assets were transformed into living political capital. Russia suddenly appeared as a benefactor of peace, without spending a single ruble of its active budget. Washington was cornered. Accept the money, and the U.S. would implicitly acknowledge Russia's right to direct its frozen assets, creating a dangerous precedent for sanctions policy. Refuse, and America would appear as a hypocrite, blocking funds for Gaza's reconstruction out of political spite. At the same time, the move flattered Trump's ego. It signaled respect for his leadership and support for his initiative. For a transactional thinker like Trump, the logic is seductive. Why not use money already sitting in American banks to solve a global problem? While Putin played calmly calculated moves, the West descended further into disorder. NATO flattered, Europe panicked, America turned inward. The old bonds of transatlantic unity frayed under the weight of competing interests and ideological fatigue. Against this backdrop, Russia emerged as a cold, immovable mass. No shouting, no moralizing, just a quiet exploitation of Western disunity. When the United States pushed for Arctic dominance, Russia did not resist because it legitimized Russia's own expansion. When Europe seethed under American pressure, Moscow stood aside, letting public anger turn towards Washington instead of itself. This was diplomacy by redirection, power not through force or sanctions, but through leverage, patience, and narrative control. Denmark may be trembling, NATO may be confused, Davos may be filled with noise and acrimony, but inside the Kremlin there is likely a silence of satisfaction. Putin does not need to shout to be heard. He merely whispers about history and money, and the Western world finds itself dancing to the rhythm he has set.